Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Habarigani, this is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for the week of April 22nd, 2023. We dedicate our program today to the memory of Ahmad Jamal, who made his transition to the ancestor world this week, and whose music you are tuned into now. He was a jazz pianist, composer, bandleader, and educator, and for 6 decades he was one of the most successful small group leaders in jazz. This hour we are in Fund Drive, but we still bring you a full hour of programming. Thank you to the listeners who donated last week, and to donate this hour to support Freedom Now and KPFK, the number to call is 818-985-KPFK, 818-985-5735, or online at kpfk.org. This hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Margaret Burnham, University Distinguished Professor of Law at Northeastern University in Boston, and Director of the Civil Rights and Restorative Project, and author of the book By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow Legal Executioners. Later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Alicia Odawale, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Tulsa, and author of the upcoming article in the Journal of American Anthropologists on the racist massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Our music clip mix includes Charles Lloyd, Robert Glasper, Mundell Lowe, McCoy Tyner, and more. So sit back, phone KPFK to pledge, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Donate $100 and receive a signed copy of Gerald Horne's latest book, hot off the presses, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Fascism, which may be around the corner in the United States, is a combination of both slavery and Jim Crow, and is presently creeping into North America on little cat feet with Texas in the vanguard. In order to be defeated, it must be understood. In order to be understood, this book must be consulted. Why is it that so many Black people in California have roots in Texas, including the first Black mayor, Tom Bradley, the first Black mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, the entertainer and actor and singer, Jamie Foxx? Read this book if you have roots in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma. Where else but on Freedom Now can you not only find out about fascism, but find out about Black American fraternities and sororities like the Omegas and the Alphas and the Deltas. Be the first on your block, in your school, in your church, in your fraternity or sorority. that has a copy of the counter-revolution of 1836. Understand why it was that it was Texas that led the war against Mexico, which led to the United States seizing California in the first place. Why is Texas in the vanguard of cracking down on so-called critical race theory, cracking down on women's reproductive freedom, cracking down on the population of Mexican descent? Why does Texas have the largest black population in the United States? Why is it that the seeds for the overthrow of Roe versus Wade, a step towards enhanced patriarchy and fascism, were planted in Texas? Where else but Freedom Now can you get serious historical analysis of the LAPD or serious analysis of black fraternities and sororities? Pick up the phone and dial
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or you can donate online at kpfk.org.
Donate $100 and receive a signed copy of the Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism.
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or you can donate online at kpfk.org.
But wait, there's more! For a limited time, you can get not only the book on Texas and the roots of U.S. fascism, arming you with knowledge of what may be a dire future, but also for a mere $180, you can also get a signed copy of the book by Gerald Horne, White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa from Rhodes to Mandela. In these pages, learn of one of the most profound victories of our movement in recent centuries, the victory over apartheid in Southern Africa in 1994. In these pages, learn of the strategy and tactics that compel this victory, strategy and tactics that are wholly applicable to today's struggles against gentrification and homelessness and police terror. In these pages, learn of the Negroes who actually were on the same side as white supremacy, a lesson wholly applicable to today's struggles. In these pages, learn of the contributions by premier artists such as Stevie Wonder and Harry Belafonte. Again, for a mere $180, receive 2 signed books, copies of The Counter-Revolution of 1836 and White Supremacy Confronted. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or you can donate online at kpfk.org.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Margaret Burnham, University Distinguished Professor of Law at Northeastern University in Boston and Director of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project and author of the book By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Burnham.
Thank you so much for having me, Professor Horne. It's a delight and pleasure to be with you and your audience at Freedom Now.
And the feeling is mutual, I assure you. So why did you produce this book, By Hands Now Known?
The book is let me first say that many hands went into the production of the book and the accompanying archive. About 10 years ago, I began investigating cases from the Jim Crow era that had not been properly resolved. Cases from the Civil Rights era. And I quickly then turned my attention to the Jim Crow era and realized that there were thousands of cases which had not yet been explored by scholars and lawyers, and that the family members were waiting for answers. So I set out to begin looking at some of those cases and working with the family members and other activists and scholars to try to recall this history. And in the process, I recalled not just the stories, not just the cases, but also the larger and largely forgotten political culture in African-American communities across the country as folks fought back against this kind of violence. Much of this has been forgotten, and so this is an effort to recover the stories for the benefit of the families and as well for the completion of our story of American history.
So you're critical of the courts and the structure of U.S. law. Why is that?
Well, because the courts had the power and the authority and the duty and responsibility to interrupt this the massive violence that I recount in the book. And it's up to us to examine why that didn't happen, why the courts were unresponsive. So we pretty much know the story of Southern courts. That's a well-known story. What perhaps is not as well known is the failure of the federal government adequately to intervene when it had the tools to do so. So the laws that were adopted in the wake of Reconstruction, at the inception of Reconstruction, were designed to address racist violence, lethal racist violence, racial terror killings. And they did so for a few years until, of course, redemption. And then those laws were allowed to just sit and gather dust and dirt while the Justice Department turned its attention to other endeavors and other projects. This was a period of time in which the federal government, as we know it today, was being built, was being established. The administrative state was being built across the early decades and mid-decades of the 20th century, and yet nothing was done in this area. It's also the case that the civil rights leaders like John Lewis and others argued for reinforced legislation in the late 1950s, early 1960s that would have, again, addressed the plague and atrocity of Jim Crow era killings. And yet that too failed. There was no legislation when the civil rights legislation of the 1960s was adopted. There were no provisions in that legislation to address these kinds of this kind of crime.
So there's a section in your book entitled "Raced Transportation." What does that mean?
Well, here I focused on, the well-known story of Jim Crow transportation, but I look at it based on my arguments here are based on new evidence, new research that suggests, first of all, how deeply scarred the experience of soldiers was during the Jim Crow era on account of the necessity of having to ride Jim Crow. And I revived some of the stories, including the story of one Booker Spicely, who was killed in Durham, in Durham, North Carolina. He was trying to get back home to his base in uniform, and he was killed by a bus driver after he had the audacity to ask the bus driver why he had to move to a backseat when a soldier in the same uniform was positioned in front of him on the bus. In other words, he challenged the Jim Crow seating, and for it, the bus driver took out his gun and shot and killed him. Bus driver was acquitted. That's a story, as well as the others that I recount in the book, that is simply just not well known. And it tells a lot about the double victory campaign of the World War II era. It tells a lot about these stories. Also tell a lot about what veterans faced when they came back home, and the ways in which they bit by bit, challenge by challenge, resistance by resistance, sought to build the movement that is well known and that begins really in the early 1950s. So here I'm simply trying to describe the ways in which these transportation systems, which again could have been fixed by the federal government, both the Army as well as at that point the War Department as well as the Justice Department, could have fixed this problem, and it never did. So again, it's a federalism story, and it's also a resistance story.
Speaking of resistance, to what extent did Black people and their allies resist what was going on during this period?
Professor Horne, as you well know, and as you've recounted in your many books, resistance has been is and will, and perhaps will so long as you and I are here, be the hallmark of African American existence since we first landed on these shores. There's nothing new about African American resistance. African American life is about African American resistance. Having said that, also it's incumbent upon all of us to understand the particulars of particular forms of resistance and particular responding to particular forms of subjugation and subordination and white supremacy. And so here I look at what's different from in resistance in this period, from the earlier moments of Black resistance, as well as from the later, more well-known and more broadly documented civil rights period. So I look at labor history. I look at the relationship of labor, Black African American participation in the labor movement during this period and the ways in which it contributed to Black resistance. I look specifically at gender and the way women resisted in both typical and atypical ways, and as well. I look at how the national African American community was built on the basis of this resistance. In the first chapter of the book, I talk about rendition, these cases in which people were fleeing the South and moving to northern venues, to Detroit, to Chicago, and places like that, the warmth of other suns, as it were. And here I argue that these cases helped build a national African American community. Because the folks in the South had to depend, the activists in the South, including the legal communities in the South, had to depend on and work closely with their allies African American allies in northern cities as they sought to provide sanctuary for these individuals who were fleeing and following the same paths, many of them that had been carved out by and forged by slaves in an earlier era. So the chapters, the resistance is obviously a theme that runs across the book. I look very specifically, Professor Horne, at Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham is a deeply southern state, but it's also a very urban, deeply southern city, but also very urban. Obviously, much shaped by the labor movement in the 1930s, and certainly that story has been well told by others, but I pick up here and look at the role of the newspapers in Birmingham, and the role of organizations like the Southern Negro Youth Congress and the NAACP, the local chapter of the NAACP, and the ways in which they sought to first of all, nationalize the information they were receiving about attacks on African Americans, but also the ways in which these attacks provided them with opportunities to fight. These attacks became essentially the beating heart of a resistance movement that looked not just at police violence, but then also looked at labor rights and looked at the rights of women and the rights of to equal education, so that all these things really the police violence, which was endemic in Birmingham, Alabama, becomes the fulcrum, as it were, for a resistance movement that looks to other and related issues.
What role does abduction play in your book?
So, as I said, the first chapter of the book is vaguely chronological, and the first chapter is about the abduction. It's about the ways in which individuals fled the South in order to to find safe harbor in other places. And there's also another chapter, which I think is perhaps what you're referring to now, which is my chapter on kidnapping. And here in the book, I sort of begin to hone in on a particular area of the law. And the argument I make here is that there were certain aspects of the legal regime that were simply unenforceable with respect to African Americans, and that's across the legal regime. But specifically, I look at kidnapping and abduction because I make the argument that became that there was no that kidnapping was unenforceable when it was a white person kidnapping an African American. And my argument here is that this is a legacy essentially of slavery. Slavery, essentially the central characteristic of slavery, of enslavement, is that you had to kowtow to the orders of white people. If they said go here, you had to go here, no matter who they were, and no matter whether you were slave or free. And so I argue that this what became essentially a decriminalization of a crime which was in most of these southern jurisdictions a capital offense becomes unenforceable when it's a black person who is subject to kidnapping. And I use, for example, the case of Emmett Till, which was a kidnapping, which is in addition to a murder case, was a kidnapping case. And it's just one of many of these cases in which a kidnapping charge could have, but were never charged. And so I use this as just one example of the ways in which racialized law distorted legal practice, and I look here also at what the legacies of that are.
What about the Screws case? What did that case involve, and what role does it play in your book?
So Screws is a fairly well-known case, well-known to lawyers, if not as well-known to lay people. But the case tells this is the case was one handled by the Supreme Court. It's again a racial terror killing in a small town in Georgia. The murderous sheriff was named Screws. And ultimately, although acquitted by the local jury was tried and convicted in a federal court, the facts are really quite straightforward. There was a gentleman by the name of Robert Hall who protested Screws, the sheriff's theft of his gun, and Hall got himself a lawyer and appeared before a grand jury. And the sheriff thought that this was an audacious and unforgivable act. And he got a couple of his guys together and he said, Hall has lived one day, that Negro's lived one day too long. He got him, dragged him from his house on a fake warrant, took him to the courthouse steps. And right there on the courthouse steps, he killed him. They beat him so badly that all the neighborhood was alit because people all around were hearing the shouts, the beating, and Hall himself. So that's the case that formed the basis of the Supreme Court's decision on how far federal prosecutors could go in pursuing these cases. And the Supreme Court took a dive on the case and made it even more difficult for federal prosecutors to pursue these cases. And I describe Screws because it really it's a touchstone and a turning point in the book. In this era of the absence of federal prosecution. And so what happens after Screws is you have Thurgood Marshall and other lawyers pleading with the Justice Department to take cases, these horrific cases, and to pursue them in the South because there was no possibility of justice from local jurors and local prosecutors, and it just doesn't happen. The next time the Justice Department successfully takes on a case after Screws, and Screws is 1944, 1945. The next time the court takes on a case is 1965, 20 years later, when the court finally, when the federal government, the DOJ, finally prosecutes the sheriff Rainey involved in the murder of James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Schwerner and Goodman, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner. That's the next time the court that there's a successful prosecution. So the book is really just an account of failure on the part of and maybe this. I'm sure your listeners will say, well, so what's the big surprise? What's new here? And I guess there's not much new here. But even though this is a well-known story, I think some of the details and the conclusions that we can draw from them are perhaps not as well known. And I know what's not well known is that the families, repeatedly as we did this work, we came across families who didn't really know the details of how they lost their loved ones in the 1930s and 1940s. And these are folks whose close relatives are still alive and who are interested to see what the government did and what the government didn't do.
Now, in your acknowledgments, you give special thanks to Professor Cheryl Harris of UCLA Law School. Why did you do that?
Professor Harris was one of many who partnered with me on this project and walked down these roads that I traveled as I moved from library to library and from town to town all across the South, hill and vale, across Mississippi, Georgia, Florida. I had to have someone who was not necessarily doing the same work, but knew the field well, who could turn me in the right direction and turn me away from the wrong direction. And that was what Professor Harris did. From the very inception of this project in 2007, she was with us, helping us theorize and conceptualize and argue these points and illuminate this history. She has a deep and abiding understanding of not only the history, but as well the legal history. And she's she's a fighter and a progressive and an activist, and so she was certainly the right person, proved to be the right person to help us articulate a successful project.
You lay out a reparations program at the end of your book. Why is that?
Reparations is the call of the moment, with good reason and long overdue. And we need to think not just about reparations for the atrocities of slavery, although obviously HR 40 is the centerpiece of our work around reparations, but as well we need to think about how to chunk reparations claims so that we can win some victories along the road. And I argue in the book, I suggest in the book, that the families that whose tragedies and whose struggles and whose resistance I have described are particularly worthy, not just worthy's perhaps the wrong word, but particularly justify a reparations project. This is a known universe. And what was done to them, what they went through, were crimes at the time they were committed. So you don't have a temporality problem of any sort. And this is recent history. It's history. Those who endured these periods, many of them are still alive. And so this is a particularly easy, low-hanging fruit reparations case, is what I argue in the book. And of course, in order to make that argument, you have to take on all of the issues around reparations, the who gets, the why they get, and the who pays. And so I try to do that in as concise and as succinct a form as I can, as a prescription as I conclude the book.
Finally, Professor Burnham, author of the book By Hands Now Known, what next for your civil rights and restorative justice project, as well the Center for Law, Equity, and Race at Northeastern University Law School, which you co-direct?
Thank you so much for that question, Gerald. For me, my next project involves an investigation into the execution of African American men for the alleged crime of rape. And let me just, I know our time is tight, so let me just give you one statistic. In the state of Virginia, 156 men were executed either for rape or for attempted rape. And of those 156 men, 152 of them were African American men. This too is a history, the general outlines of which we know. This is not a new story. But again, there are folks around who endured these atrocities, and their story has not yet been told. There's been a lot of this is in the legal literature. There's a fairly, if you look at the court cases, you can find pieces and bits of this story in the court cases. But the numbers, shocking. That's just one number. Virginia's perhaps the worst state. It's only 2 states that killed people for so-called attempted rape, and Virginia was one of them. And the only people who ever died for that were black men. And by the way, I'm only talking about crimes against white women. As far as I know, and I could be wrong, and I'd be glad to be found to be wrong. No black woman the rape of a black woman was never one which for which the death penalty was actually imposed. And so that's my next project. Again, looking at the abject failure of the justice system and asking the question about the relationship between that abject failure in those earlier years and the system that the criminal legal system that we're working with today, and asking the question what the relationship is between this history and the claim, the call for abolition today. And so, again, I'm looking at this history for its own sake, because it needs to be revived, recalled, and recorded. So I look at it for its own sake, but I also obviously look at it for what it teaches us about today.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Margaret Burnham, University Distinguished Professor of Law at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, and author of the book By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you, Gerald, and regards and solidarity to all my listeners and all the friends of Freedom Now. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you, Gerald.
Ditto. Thank you.
Cracks in the abode of death. Few people really know the nature of death rows. It is used as a political prop by politicians, and is thus a stepping stone to their gateway of power. But death row is really far more than that. It is a place where men and women, and until recently, even juveniles, were sent to live and die in aching loneliness and despair. That's because death row was specifically designed to isolate people physically and psychologically. On death row, American law reconstructed a caste of the untouchables, where no one was allowed to touch you. Not a child, not a parent, not even one's very spouse. But that's not all. You were even isolated from other people on death row. You were in solitary confinement, locked in a cell, alone, for 23 hours a day, until you were executed or left death row. Many, perhaps most men, spent decades under such conditions. Why? Because the state, by creating such extreme conditions, sought to make people into a kind of living dead, so broken that actual death will be but a relief. That fever seems to be breaking, at least in Pennsylvania. Here, today, is a much smaller death row, where the number has fallen to around 100. And men spend over 8 hours a day out of their cells. They have contact visits. Now, the state will no longer sign death warrants and is seeking the abolition of the death penalty. The tide seems to have turned, and death row is no longer the death row of cruel memory. With love, not fear, this is Mumia Ahmad Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
Donate $100 and receive a signed copy of Gerald Horne's latest book, hot off the presses, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Fascism, which may be around the corner in the United States, is a combination of both slavery and Jim Crow, and is presently creeping into North America on little cat feet, with Texas in the vanguard. In order to be defeated, it must be understood. In order to be understood, this book must be consulted. Why is it that so many black people in California have roots in Texas, including the first black mayor, Tom Bradley, the first black mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, the entertainer and actor and singer, Jamie Foxx? Read this book if you have roots in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma. Where else but on Freedom Now can you not only find out about fascism, but find out about Black American fraternities and sororities like the Omegas and the Alphas and the Deltas? Be the first on your block, in your school, in your church, in your fraternity or sorority that has a copy of the Counter-Revolution of 1836. Understand why it was that it was Texas that led the war against Mexico, which led to the United States seizing California in the first place. Why is Texas in the vanguard of cracking down on so-called critical race theory, cracking down on women's reproductive freedom, cracking down on the population of Mexican descent? Why does Texas have the largest black population in the United States? Why is it that the seeds for the overthrow of Roe versus Wade, a step towards enhanced patriarchy and fascism, were planted in Texas? Where else but Freedom Now can you get serious historical analysis of the LAPD, or serious analysis of black fraternities and sororities? Pick up the phone and dial
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or you can donate online at kpfk.org.
Donate $100 and receive a signed copy of The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas, Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism.
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or you can donate online at kpfk.org.
But wait, there's more. For a limited time, you can get not only the book on Texas and the roots of U.S. fascism, arming you with knowledge of what may be a dire future, but also for a mere $180, you can also get a signed copy of the book by Gerald Horne, White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa from Rhodes to Mandela. In these pages, learn of one of the most profound victories of our movement in recent centuries, the victory over apartheid in Southern Africa in 1994. In these pages, learn of the strategy and tactics that compelled this victory, strategy and tactics that are wholly applicable to today's struggles against gentrification and homelessness and police terror. In these pages, learn of the Negroes who actually were on the same side as white supremacy, a lesson wholly applicable to today's struggles. In these pages, learn of the contributions by premier artists such as Stevie Wonder and Harry Belafonte. Again, for a mere $180, receive 2 signed books, copies of The Counter-Revolution of 1836 and White Supremacy Confronted. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or you can donate online at kpfk.org.
From KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. And with me on the line is Alicia Odawale, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Tulsa and author of a forthcoming article in the journal American Anthropologist on the racist massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma of 1921. Welcome to Freedom Now, Professor Odewale.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So you are an archaeologist.
Yes.
What is an archaeologist and how did you get involved in that profession?
Archaeology is all about trying to uncover remnants of the past, like things, stuff that's been left behind by people in the past, to try to understand more about culture and people who lived in the past. I got into this being a weird high school girl trying to learn Latin and Greek. And then I got a whole degree in classics. And then I fell into archaeology because I was growing frustrated with the lack of stories and myths around Black people, and really wondering where people who looked like me were in these sort of epic myths of the past and, classical tales in Greek and Roman literature. So I fell into something called African diaspora archaeology, which is what I do now. So I'm an archaeologist, but I specialize in looking at the things left behind by people of African descent in the past.
And of course, momentarily, we'll get into that with regard to Tulsa and what you're doing today. But to begin with, outline what occurred in Tulsa in 1921 and what is your role today in uncovering that horrible reality?
Well, in 1921, and it depends on who you ask how that event is described, but May 31st through June 1st of 1921, there was what some people call a massacre, some people call a genocide, Holocaust. There's so many different terms that have been used to describe the event in 1921, but for people locally, a lot of folks describe this as a massacre. But there's so many other terms that can be used to describe this, but what really happened is you have an attack. I describe it in how I'm writing as an attack on Greenwood, specifically on a Black community, a Black and Indigenous community that lived in Greenwood, which I describe as an all-Black town that is situated next to Tulsa, adjacent to Tulsa, and Tulsa at the time was a sundown town. So between the two, you have a war. And this attack erupted, and a lot of people lost their lives in the process, but also a lot of property was destroyed. But what I am doing now is trying to highlight what happened in the aftermath through the lens of archaeology, and really highlight these signs of life, these spaces that were rebuilt, these how the community rallied around schools and churches and residential neighborhoods and rebuilt their lives. And archaeology can help tell that story.
So you mentioned the phrase sundown town. I take it you're referring to a town where Black people are not supposed to be there after the sun goes down.
Exactly.
Right.
And a lot of people don't realize that Tulsa was part of that. People were not really welcome to live in Tulsa, but could work and could visit. But people lived in Greenwood.
Mm-hmm. Now, the apparent trigger was the allegation that a young Black man somehow had had an unpleasant encounter with a younger Euro-American woman, which outraged the Euro-American citizenry, which caused them to go on the rampage. Is that a fair assessment?
So it depends on who you ask. There's different narratives around this. Particularly, you're referring to Dick Rowland and Sarah Page. In some accounts, there's an encounter that happens swiftly in the Drexel building, and there's an elevator incident where possibly Dick Rowland tripped and possibly grabbed her arm, and she screams. Other people describe this as the two having a relationship prior to this, and Sarah screamed out to prevent anyone else from finding out that she was part of an interracial couple, which was illegal at the time in Oklahoma. Other accounts suggest that this trigger was just one event, that actually there were things leading up to this, even circulating in the newspapers, that something needed to be done about Little Africa, something needed to be done about Greenwood, even before 1921. So premeditated, this event sparking it, there's different accounts here as to what is actually sparking this attack.
Mm-hmm. And the ultimate result is approximately hundreds of Black people killed. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. And we can say hundreds or we can say thousands, because again, there's different narratives describing numbers fluctuating between 100 to 500 to into the thousands. The estimate that a lot of people are comfortable with now is 300, but this is an estimate. There is still no real tangible number that we've arrived at to account for all the people murdered and wounded in the course of this attack.
So in your forthcoming article in American Anthropologist, you use the term lingering trauma. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is there's a thing called historical trauma and generational trauma, that even after a collective mass trauma event has happened, the response and how that response carries on through generation can be impacted by how the story is told. And for us in Greenwood, there's a lot of people outside of Greenwood that have control over the narrative and how the story is retold and shifted and exploited in some cases. And that affects your own knowledge, your own sense of self. And so that lingering trauma, when things are not resolved, when you don't have control over your narrative, and even control over the archives that can lend evidence to this story, can really impact how that trauma is manifested and the response to that collective trauma.
Mm-hmm. Now, you write that from 1921 to 1941, from 1921, there were grocery stores, 41 grocery stores and 30 restaurants in North Tulsa. Now it's a food desert. How did the massacre contribute to that situation?
That's a great question. And in the context of both 1921, the attack in 1921, and the second attack on Greenwood in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we have a cycle of what I call erasure and violence and really environmental racism. And in that, there's this divestment of resources away from North Tulsa. So once things are destroyed in 1921, the community fights to rebuild. But even in that rebuilding, those rebuilt structures are then torn down again. And there's a constant sort of exploiting and taking of resources out of Greenwood, to that what you're left with today is what we've fought to preserve, what is left. Which has created this food desert. And really, in the city of Tulsa, there's equality indicators that are published every year by the city. And every year it comes out that people in North Tulsa, which is where Greenwood is situated, live on average 7 years shorter than everyone else in the city. And this is part of that problem, an ongoing problem.
Now, to that end, you also write that from 1951 to 1979, there was what you described, quote, a second war on Greenwood, unquote. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, for me, I describe it as a second attack because that period is what is referred to as urban renewal, but locally we call it urban removal. And this is a period of, and this is not just for Tulsa, but cities around the country experience this sort of forced removal of Black, Indigenous, Latinx families out of their homes in the guise of eminent domain to make way for public use spaces, parks and lakes and other things that were built on top of people's homes. So that same thing happened in Tulsa, but we had a highway going directly through Greenwood and historic Black Wall Street. So that is the second attack I'm referring to.
Mm-hmm. Now, news accounts of late suggest that remains of certain victims from 1921 have been uncovered. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, there is quite a few individuals. The last tally that I think we have as far as the excavations that were done for the city's search for mass graves, there were 35 individuals that have now been found in a mass grave that previously were unknown, unmarked graves, unknown to history, and now they've been found, and we're now in the process of trying to pair up DNA analysis to possibly find their descendants. But this is a long process, and we're just getting started with that.
Now, I take it that this is part of the process that you describe as restorative justice archaeology. What is that?
Restorative justice archaeology is about doing archaeology in a way that restores healing in the event of mass trauma, in the event of historical trauma. And that restorative justice is part of giving back and having archaeology be a tool for social justice. And one of the ways we're doing that, the mass grave search is what I call retributive justice, and that it's being treated as a homicide investigation. So you're getting into the who, what, when, where, why of a homicide crime. What I do in my research is focus on the healing and the aftermath and how we can highlight what we contributed to history, all the things that were built, how Greenwood was built in the first place, instead of just what happened to us. But we need both. We need the retributive justice and we need the restorative justice. We need both.
Well, let me return to a point you mentioned a few moments ago, which is what led up to this Holocaust genocide massacre. Is it fair to suggest that there was a certain amount of jealousy of what Black people had accumulated? And as you respond, also, could you elaborate on your earlier point that this was possibly a Black and Indigenous community in Greenwood?
Yeah, so one of the sites that I'm researching in my archaeology work is a site called Standpipe Hill. And this hill space is where the most affluent members in Greenwood lived. And they are situated in this, literally on a higher elevation plane on top of a hill. And it looked down on the rest of Tulsa. So if you can imagine the jealousy that was already stirring for this community that's thriving in the face of Jim Crow, having a different elevation difference and having to physically look up to this community, it really changes the conversation, because as an archaeologist being on top of this hill looking down on the rest of the city, you can just imagine the feelings that would stir up when they are supposed to be legally oppressed. So that's part of the things that I'm looking into right now.
Mm-hmm. And I understand as well that there might have been some sort of jealousy driven by the fact that some of these Black and Indigenous people had automobiles, particularly well-appointed automobiles, at a time when this particular a consumer item was just becoming popular. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and not just automobiles, they had airplanes. They had whole mechanic shops that they opened up to maintain those vehicles. So people from the white side of town had to come over to Greenwood to get their cars serviced because they're the ones that had the vehicles and the skills to maintain them.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you recommend that young Black women who are aspiring to become an academic go into archaeology? And if so, would you suggest that they study with you at the University of Tulsa?
Well, that's a great question. So I have a few students now, but I'm actually transitioning to Texas. So if students would love to come be a part of this work, one, we have now partnered with National Geographic, and we are so thankful to have their support in this next season as we're going into our season in 2023. And we're going to be recruiting for more students, but they'll have to follow me down to Texas to do that work. But we're still actively researching in Greenwood and making this going to be a larger sphere because we're creating a new curriculum that will be archaeology informed and led by descendants, and we're so thankful for that work.
So you're going to a university in Texas, is that true?
Yes.
Oh, which one, in case people want to reach out to you?
We're still in the process of negotiations, but still actively on the market as well. So.
I understand. Well, finally, Professor Odawale,
yes,
just give us an idea of what archaeology involves. When I see pictures, I see archaeologists in rough-hewn outfits with spades and cudgels, digging ground, sifting through dirt.
Yes.
Give us a snapshot of what your profession involves.
So it kind of depends, but for me, I'm more, of course, a historical archaeologist. There are people that are working in the deep past and working with lithic material and early hominin species and all these other things. But for me, I'm working in the more recent past, and a lot of what I do is community-based. So I'm talking to community members, trying to figure out what they know in living memory, and then trying to go beyond that with the artifacts so we can extend what that living memory looks like and tell stories. So I use archaeology to tell stories. That's really my goal, but this is just one tool that we can use. I lean heavily on archives and written word, but also oral testimony. So I blend all of it together in my work to try to tell a story.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Odawale, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma, and author of the forthcoming article in the journal American Anthropology on the Racist Massacre in Tulsa in 1921. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now from KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
And in closing, we'd like to thank all those who donated this hour. And thank you to our guests, Dr. Margaret Burnham. Thank you, Dr. Alicia Odawale. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. This program, as well as prior programs, can be reheard for the next 60 days. You can go to kpfk.org, audio archives, and scroll to Freedom Now. You can also go to kpfk.org and make your donation to the station this hour, or you can call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Again, thank you to everyone for your support. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. And until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.